Of all of the dark stories we covered on this channel, today's story is one of the most bizarre and psychologically downward descent into absolute madness. It's not just about murder, it's about what one man did with the bodies after death. We're answering the question, can a lifetime of crushing emotional isolation create a compulsion so perverse that it blurs the line between the living and the dead? We'll find out. The small farming community of Plainfield, Wisconsin, had no idea the local oddball, Ed Gein, was digging up their loved ones. They knew he was strange, but they missed the critical psychological detail. His isolation wasn't just physical, it was a profound cognitive distortion that made the dead feel more real than the living. The complete clinical breakdown of his mother's fixation and the specific psychological mechanism that triggered his crimes will illustrate with a simple diagnostic model later on. This is the only part of his story that you haven't heard yet, how a desperate need for a connection spiraled into an ultimate violation.
Stay curious, stay safe.
Welcome. I'm a licensed professional counselor and I talk about the psychology behind the crimes. Today we're analyzing a case that's highly requested and horrifying, a foundational study in extreme psychological deviance. And I want to offer a trigger warning here. This case involves themes of violence, body desecration, and sexual deviance. Viewer discretion is advised. Without further ado, let's pull back the curtains and examine this horrifying story together. This is the story of Edward Gein. To understand the man who would become infamous, we must first look at the psychological landscape of his childhood. Ed Gein was born in 1906. He was raised on an isolated farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, with his older brother Henry and his parents. The dominant psychological figure in his life, the emotional absolute, was his mother, Augusta Gein. She was a fanatically religious, controlling woman who preached the inherent evil of women's sex in the world outside their isolated home. This environment created a distinct psychological precursor. His world was one of intense emotional abuse, religious terror, and a total isolation. Augusta taught her sons that the normal world was corrupt and that they were destined for damnation. Ed's entire framework for human connection was warped by her. His father, George, was passive and largely uninvolved, leaving Augusta's suffocating control unchecked. This meant Ed never had a healthy, contrasting model for human relationships or gender roles. When we look at this through a clinical lens, we see the complete absence of a secure attachment figure. Ed only learned one way to relate: submission and reverence for a demanding, critical female figure. The emotional price for this submission was the total stunting of his own identity and social development. Augusta's religious fixation was more than just conservative. It was a form of psychological imprisonment. She would use graphic readings from the Bible about sin and damnation, especially targeting any emerging interest Ed had in the outside world, effectively weaponizing his developing sexuality against him. This fostered a profound internal conflict that we later see manifesting in his compulsion to create female forms. The most crucial psychological clue to his future crimes is the death of his brother Henry. Henry attempted to stand up to their mother. What happened next is often overlooked, but it tells us everything about Ed's hidden psychological fragility and what he was willing to sacrifice to maintain his rigid world structure. The escalation of Ed's strange behavior is marked by a series of profound losses. In 1940, his father died. 4 years later, his brother Henry died of suspicious circumstances in a farm fire. Ed helped extinguish the blaze, but the coroner noted bruises on Henry's head. No further investigation was conducted. Henry's attempt to challenge Augusta's control had failed, and Ed remained bound to her. After Henry's death, Ed was left alone with Augusta. This period intensified his symbiotic dependence. Clinically, this is a dangerous state where one person's identity is wholly wrapped up in another's. Ed essentially lived to serve his mother. When Augusta died in 1945, the psychological floor dropped out from under Ed. The one person who gave his life structure, however destructive, was gone. This is where the story shifts dramatically. Ed didn't just passively mourn, he immediately sealed off her room and the downstairs parlor, creating a sacrificial shrine to his loss. The rest of the house became a chaotic, filthy mess, but these rooms were pristine, preserved in time almost like a tomb. This act demonstrates a severe avoidant coping mechanism where he physically froze the past rather than facing the emotional pain of the present. The next 10 years saw a rapid decline into genuine psychosis. He began reading anatomy books and stories of concentration camps atrocities. His interest was not academic. It was a way to normalize and process his own escalating fantasies surrounding the human body. He was looking for a psychological roadmap to the forbidden, a way to bridge the gap between his loneliness and his overwhelming need for the female form. Ed started doing odd jobs in the community, often babysitting for neighbors. He was present, yet totally detached. The neighbors saw an eccentric man, but they failed to see the profound affect flattening, a severe lack of emotional expression. That was a key psychological indicator of its detachment from reality. He could interact without connecting. Ed's first known act was not murder, but body snatching. His psychological motivation was simple. He was trying to recreate his mother. But the gruesome details of how he used these bodies reveal a specific kind of disassociation that paved the way for murder. The choice of which bodies he initially targeted is a profound clue about his internal life. Ed's descent into full criminal manifestation began around 1951, 6 years after his mother's death, when he started visiting the local cemeteries. He targeted recently buried middle-aged women, whom he felt resembled his mother, an act of perverse, backward idolization that required the physical form. His crimes came to light in November 1957 with the disappearance of a hardware store owner, Bernice Worden, the second of his 2 known murder victims. The first was a tavern owner, Mary Hogan, in 1954. The main plot, the crime, centers on Bernice. Her son, Deputy Frank Worden, was the last to see her. A receipt signed by Ed for a gallon of antifreeze was a single clue that led investigators to his farmhouse. This simple piece of paper unraveled the investigation and horrified the investigators. The investigators' initial focus was on the missing person, not the potential scare of the horror that they would soon find out. When the sheriff and captain arrived at the property, they were first met by the overwhelming sense of neglect. The initial visual was a typical yet isolated Wisconsin farmhouse. This allowed Ed to hide in plain sight for years, an object lesson in how social isolation can provide perfect criminal camouflage. When the sheriff and officers entered the house, what they saw was shocking. They were confronted with a scene of utter psychological chaos. The house was filthy, a hoarder's paradise of junk, but also a gallery of human remains. Ed's actions in the farmhouse were a direct physical manifestation of his psychological and emotional state following his mother's death. He wasn't simply a killer. He was a collector and a craftsman, driven by a deep-seated need for replacement and reanimation. The choice of using skin and bones to create household objects like bowls, lampshades, and a chair was a reflection of his desperate attempt to populate his home with the bodies that could never truly leave him. The fact that he was constructing a woman's suit from various female parts is the ultimate psychological statement, a profound desire to physically embody the lost feminine authority figure, his mother. This isn't just necrophilia, it's a profound failure of object permanence, combined with a bizarre attempt to gender appropriation stemming from his warped sexual identity. The actions were a reflection of his need for complete, overwhelming control over the female form, a control he never had over his mother. This gruesome display brought the clues full circle, confirming the sheer depth of his psychosis. The antifreeze receipt wasn't just a clue, it led to the exposure of a man who had been secretly violating the sanctity of the community for years, all to fill a psychological void. This small community had unknowingly been living amongst the physical remnants of their dead loved ones for years. We have the facts, the investigation, and all of the evidence. Now, let's put on the clinical lens and apply the psychological framework that makes this case a classic study in deviance. Ed Gein was found legally insane and not guilty by reason of mental defect. These are my speculations, not a diagnosis of Ed, but his behavior suggests a profile that points toward a profound early onset schizoid personality disorder, with strong features of sexual sadism disorder that manifested post-mortem. The key to understanding Ed is his ASS, affect flattening, social detachment, and seclusion. Affect flattening is a clinical sign where a person shows a noticeable reduction in their outward emotional expression. For Ed, this meant he appeared to have no emotional range. His face was blank, his voice was monotonous, and he exhibited little to no body language. He could be talking about farming or murder with the exact same unnerving lack of feeling. It created a psychological distance that made him seem inhuman to others. Social detachment is the inability or unwillingness to connect with others on a genuine emotional level. It's a psychological wall a person builds between themselves and the outside world. This meant Ed had no close, genuine relationships and was incapable of empathy. His interactions were purely surface level and transactional, allowing him to view others, alive or dead, not as fellow human beings, but as objects to fulfill his own warped needs. While seclusion can refer to physical restraint in a clinical setting, in the context of personality and environment, it describes the active physical separation from society. For Ed, this was a voluntary confinement to his isolated farmhouse. It allowed him to retreat from the complexities of the real world and create his own private reality, a world governed by his mother's memory and his delusional fantasies, where the norms of society and morality did not apply. The isolation was both a symptom of his condition and a necessary condition for his crimes. These three traits created the perfect psychological ecosystem for his crimes. He had a profound inability to form genuine emotional bonds, making it easier to view human bodies as objects, not people. The grave robbing wasn't simply a twisted hobby. It was a form of fetish compulsion. The bodies were stand-ins for the emotional connection he was pathologically incapable of achieving. He couldn't create life, so he tried to reanimate it, or at least to preserve and wear the memory of female companionship. Now let's discuss his competency trial. The initial legal argument hinged on his state of mind. Psychiatrists found him to be in a state of psychotic disorganization, believing that the world outside was a dangerous fantasy and his mother was the sole reality. The fact that he confessed to the murders and the grave robbings without any apparent remorse, just a detached factual recount, was a critical indicator of his total emotional anesthesia. He wasn't lying. He simply could not process the moral weight of his actions. This profound lack of insight sealed his fate as mentally unfit to stand trial. Here's what Ed's psychological descent looks like. It started with crushing dominance. Augusta had complete control of Ed from the very early age. This led to extreme religious identification, enforced isolation, emotional abuse, and demonization of women, which led to no self-concept. Ed lost all autonomous identity and stunted his personal development, an inability to form genuine relationships, and an internalization of a warped worldview. Then it led to a catastrophic void. Ed's mother's death created a symbiotic collapse. He had a complete breakdown of his psychological structure, a profound maladaptive mourning which created severe mental disorganization. This spawned a compulsive recreation and reanimation of replacement fantasy. His obsessive need to fill the void and his attempts to physically resurrect Augusta fueled his morbid compulsions. And then finally, Ed's necrophilic transmutation ultimately unraveled his reality. This was his final descent into psychosis, blurring life and death that ended into complete loss of sanity. His criminal actions were driven by a severe case of maladaptive mourning where he was unable to process the death of his mother. Instead of acceptance, he acted out his need for her through the bodies of other women. But the ultimate transgression was an attempt to transcend death and loss, a desperate, disorganized attempt to fix his fractured psyche. When we analyze the psychological landscape of this crime, we must turn our attention to the community and the victims, Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. The small, quiet nature of Plainfield actually contributed to their vulnerability. In a community where people genuinely trust one another and lock their doors more against the elements than other people, the mental guard is naturally lowered. The psychological impact on the victim's family, especially the community, was a total destruction of their sense of safety and security. This case created a collective community trauma unique to grave robbing. The horror was compounded by the fact that Ed wasn't just a killer, he was a thief of final dignity. The realization that their loved ones' graves had been violated created a unique form of psychological trauma, a violation that went beyond death and shattered the community's trust in the ground itself. For the families, the subsequent trial and media frenzy led to a significant re-traumatization as they were forced to confront the gruesome details. The closure they sought was repeatedly denied by the sensational nature of the crimes. Ed Gein was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. He was later transferred to Mendota Mental Health Institute, where he died in 1984. And the physical symbol of his depravity, his isolated farmhouse full of those body parts, burned down in 1958, an end to the physical house of horrors. The people of Plainsville found a small degree of resolution in the destruction of that property, but the story of Plainfield is a permanent lesson in how extreme isolation coupled with intense psychological control can breed pathology that is almost impossible to comprehend. It's a testament to the fact that emotional needs, when severely deprived, can twist a human psyche into something unrecognizable. If this deep dive into the psychological isolation that led Ed's crimes resonated with you, you will want to watch my analysis of this next killer. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.